Of the City of Salem Budget Committee for December 13th, 2017. Would the recorder please take roll call?
Mayor Bennett? Absent. Member Kaser?
Present.
Member Anderson? Absent. Member Nanke?
Here.
Member McCoy?
Here.
Member Ossick? Absent. Member Hoy?
Here.
Member Cook? Here. Member Lewis?
Here.
Member Nordyke?
Here.
Member Tigan?
Here.
Member Sund?
Here.
Member Moore Green?
Here.
Member Bassett?
Here.
Member Judy?
Here.
Member Hazlitt?
Here.
Member Bergman?
Here.
Member Milton? Absent.
Thank you. Will you join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. May I have a motion to approve the minutes of the November 6, 2017 meeting?
So moved. Second.
Okay, I have a motion from Member McCoy, or Councilor McCoy, and a second from Councilor, Nanke, pardon me.
We sound the same, maybe.
No, we don't.
The motion is from Councilor Nanke. The second is from Councilor Hoy. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of accepting the November 6, 2017 Budget Committee minutes as provided, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? The motion passes. Thank you. We're going to move to item number 4 on our agenda, and that's the handout material. If Budget Officer Kelly Jacobs would come forward and review our handout material, please.
Thank you very much. Kelly Jacobs, the city's budget officer, and I'll be very brief in my review this evening. You have 5 handout items with this agenda. The first is the fiscal year 2019 through fiscal year 2023 5-year forecast document. It was placed at your desk this evening. Members of the committee also received this electronically earlier in the week. The other items in the agenda packet, and oh, by the way, we're not going to be reviewing this right at the moment because Deputy City Manager Casey Duncan will be reviewing the forecast with you in just a few moments, as soon as I'm done. The other items in your packet are quarterly financial reports. We have 2 reports for fiscal year 4th quarter, so that's the period ending June 30th, 2017, one for the City of Salem and one for the Urban Renewal Agency. We also have quarterly reports for the first period of the current fiscal year, one again for the City of Salem and one for the Urban Renewal Agency. I'd like to focus just for a moment on the report for fiscal year 2017, the 4th quarter City of Salem report. So that's item 4B in your packet. I just wanted to do a little orientation for you of these reports. So we are pulling together some really general formats for these quarterly reports and different formats for different reporting periods. And you'll note that the 2 reports for the 4th quarter, the 2 fiscal year 2017 4th quarter reports, one for the city, one for the Urban Renewal Agency, are similar. And the report for the 1st quarter 2018 for both entities, they're also similar. So we're trying to kind of structure these reports so you have an idea that you're looking at the 4th quarter or you're looking at the first quarter by the appearance of the report. So for just a moment, let's focus on that fiscal year 2017 4th quarter report for the city and a little orientation relative to the data. The first 2 pages of the report are very high-level views of year-end results for city funds. So very high-level results. Beginning on the first page, there is a little ticker at the bottom of the page that provides numeric year-end results for every city fund, resources, expenditures, and ending working capital. And if the ending working capital is green in this view, so at the bottom of each page, if the ending working capital is green in this view, it means it's a larger number than the same period last year for that fund. If it's blue in color, it means that the number is less than the same period for the prior year. On page 3 of this report, there is revenue information for the general fund that appears very similar to what you saw in November with the variance analyses. And in this view, upward pointing arrows for the actual to budget column mean actual receipts were more than anticipated in the budget. And upward pointing arrows for the year-over-year column mean that fiscal year 2017 receipts were greater than fiscal year 2016. The next page, page 4, features information about general fund department budgets. And in this view, the actual to budget gold circle provides a percentage indicating the level of expenditure as compared to the budget. In every case in this view, the percentage is less than 100%, which is good. That's actually a good number. The arrows in the year-over-year column provide the comparison of actual expenditures to the prior year. So an upward pointing arrow means that the expenditures were greater than the prior year. A downward pointing arrow means the expenditures were less than the prior year. The next 3 pages of the report focus on other city funds with a variety of graphic displays for revenues and a similar display to the general fund for expenditures. So just a very brief orientation of these reports, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to entertain them. And also, if you have questions later, you're welcome to email them to me, and I'll respond to you via email. So whichever you choose. Thanks for that opportunity.
Thank you. Are there any questions?
I have
Yes,
one
Clark.
question.
Microphone.
On the fees collected from the state,
The shared revenues.
right? What about the marijuana?
We have seen marijuana receipts, but actually we received our marijuana receipts from the state in the current fiscal year. So we have received some revenues from the state for shared.
Is it meeting projections?
It is. It is.
Thank you.
Member Nordyke, and please remember to speak into your microphones. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Jacobs, I had asked you a question before our meeting today. Thank you so much for being available to answer my questions about this report. And I'm wondering, for the sake of others, perhaps who may be reviewing the report online or watching us live, planning-related fees. You explained to me what those planning-related fees, and you've noted in your report here that those fees are at 21.8% in year-over-year growth. Could you just articulate a little bit more about that?
Sure. So, and one point to make too, when we talk about percentages of growth, 21.8% is a significant percentage of growth, but it represents $130,000. In this grouping of revenues. So there's the other side of that perspective. The planning-related fees in this grouping are 3 revenue types that we receive in the general fund. One is actually called planning fees, and rather than me trying to explain to you all the nuances of what kind of planning fees we collect, I have folks here from community development who can provide more information about that if needed. But the first group is planning fees. There are dwelling plan review fees and site plan review fees. So the 3 fee types in that grouping of fees: planning, site plan review, dwelling plan review. And if you want more information about what types of planning fees, I will defer to the folks from community development who are in attendance this evening.
And is it fair to say that planning-related fees concern construction-related fees?
Yes, indeed.
Thank
That
you.
is what they're for.
Thank you very much.
Member Nanki?
Thank you, Madam Chair. On page 4, where we're talking about general fund by the departments, I know in the past we've always had a goal of 3% less, and we
3% savings?
3% savings, and that we knew that would become more and more difficult. Is that 3% still as a target, or?
In the forecast for last fiscal year, which would then be applicable to the current year budget, the savings that were projected in that forecast, 2%. So we realized that we were going to have a little more difficult time, perhaps savings. And we know that in the current fiscal year, for instance, we have our police and fire departments being fully staffed, and so it's going to be more difficult to generate that level of savings. But yes, in this particular report for fiscal year 2017, you see some percentages there that indicate that budgets were spent at a greater level than that would provide that 3% savings.
Right. There was a couple that were close, but a few of them were outliers. So just wanted to verify that we were still going to be trying to target and what that percentage may be as we
I think
move
it would be safe to say
forward.
that we're going to work at saving whatever we can save.
Yes, which is always good, but just knowing that most departments had a 3%.
Steve Power, City Manager. Also, though, we're balancing that with the direction that was provided to us by council, and that is to fill the positions that had been authorized by council, and we're also with the competitive labor market, particularly for police and fire, when we have qualified candidates, we are being aggressive in hiring them so we don't lose them to other departments. So that is reducing our savings target, our ability to achieve that savings target. However, we will be working on as a department director team working on accomplishing that target as we move through the second half of this fiscal year.
If I can just follow up on that, we just need as a budget committee to realize that it does affect our ending fund balance and working capital, so that we need to factor that in as we move through the budget process.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, next on our agenda is the presentation of the fiscal year 2019 through 2023 5-year forecast by Deputy City Manager Casey Duncan.
Good evening, Chair Green and members of the Budget Committee. I'm Deputy City Manager Casey Duncan, and I have the privilege to present to you this evening the 5-year forecast for fiscal years 2019 through fiscal years 2023. I want to begin by first recognizing and thanking first and foremost Budget Officer Kelly Jacobs and her team, as well as department directors, analysts, and all the staff who dedicated many hours that were necessary to produce this important financial planning document. This table of contents slide represents the components of my presentation this evening. Handout item 4A of the agenda includes forecasts for 12 city funds. I will briefly comment on 8 of the 12 and spend more time discussing the results for the Willamette Valley Communications Center, the transportation, utility, and general funds. Now let's take a step back and talk about why we forecast. The recently adopted mission of the city is to provide fiscally sustainable and quality services to enrich lives of present and future residents, the quality of our environment and neighborhoods, and the vitality of the economy. The recently completed strategic plan also underscores the importance of fiscal sustainability with the adoption of sustainable service delivery as one of the 7 goals. The goal is to align city services with resources and maintain a fund balance for the future. Also included is a redesigning of the budget process and identifying the desired level of services that can be sustained, revenues to support those services, and alternative ways to deliver services or generate cost savings. Presenting the forecast earlier this year than in recent years is part of the budget process redesign envisioned with the strategic plan. The information presented in the forecast validate the importance and necessity of the City Council's express commitment to sustainable services and the associated costs. A financial forecast is a widely accepted best practice to evaluate current and future fiscal conditions. The Government Financial Officers Association recommends that governments at all levels forecast major revenues and expenditures, and that the forecast period be several years into the future. In recent years, the use of 5-year forecasts has allowed the manager and council to act well in advance to prevent issues with fiscal health. One such example is the Transportation Fund. The forecast delivered in January 2015 for fiscal year 2016 provided 3 scenarios for the fund. The first scenario was anticipated revenue and expenditures with a resulting rapid and unsustainable decline in working capital. The second demonstrated the level of expenditure reductions that would be required to balance the revenues. It included an explanation of what the loss of 10 full-time and 6 seasonal positions would do to service delivery. The third scenario demonstrated what would happen if the fund was relieved of the streetlight electricity costs. The resulting savings was nearly the same as eliminating the 16 positions and severely reducing maintenance of streets and sidewalks. The next month, the City Council adopted the streetlight fee, which would become effective during the subsequent year. As another example, several years ago, the city's 911 center, or WVCC, was caught in the perfect storm of expanding its service area, unanticipated staffing attrition, hiring delays, and a resulting use of excessive overtime. As a result, working capital began to decline. At this time, a tool had not been developed to present to the member agencies scenarios demonstrating what would be required to address these issues. Forecasting provided this needed tool. In fact, 2 financial models were developed, one for identifying needed staffing required to cover the 911 shifts and to train new staff hired at the center. The second forecast used the staffing information to inform expenditure projections, which in comparison to the revenue forecast made it clear that changes needed to occur in order to maintain financially viable. The most significant issue identified in the forecast was a change in rates charged to member agencies served by the 911 Center. For years, rate increases had been minimal to zero as member agencies struggled to manage issues within their own budgets following the December 2007 recession. By using the two financial models and clearly demonstrating the effects of no or inadequate action, member agencies agreed to a significant rate increase in the first year and continuing necessary rates of increase in the succeeding 4 years. The forecast tools have been used to refine projections and determine appropriate rate increases in subsequent years. While the rate increases were and continue to be a difficult choice for member agencies, the forecasting tools provide a clear case for their necessity. As a final example, since 2008, financial forecasts have been used twice to guide expenditure decisions in the general fund. Most recently in fiscal year 2013 with the elimination of approximately 40 positions and the closure of 2 fire stations. Admittedly, forecasting has elements of both art and science. It's not an absolute prediction of the future. A forecast model projects a range of possible outcomes using known variables and assumptions. Revenues would need to be received and expenditures incurred exactly as projected for the exact result to be realized. The forecast is meant to be a source of information, one of many that the city uses to develop the upcoming fiscal year budget and to aid policy decision makers. By modeling a baseline forecast, we can provide the Budget Committee, City Council, and our community members with a long-range perspective of today's financial decisions. Forecasting provides a fiscal health checkup of revenues, expenditures, future cash flow, and working capital. Through forecasting, complex discussions regarding fiscal health can be condensed to the balance of revenues and expenditures and the constancy of working capital. The forecasts presented this evening are built around a baseline of set assumptions that represent a reasonable level of consistency with the status quo. We believe that these forecasts are even more objective than previous years, meaning we have pushed revenue and expenditure assumptions to the limits of our level of comfort in order to be as accurate as possible. There are bound to be variations from the estimates. However, we hone in at a very granular level on the major drivers of expenditures and revenue. For example, property tax information is received from the county and individual properties are compared year over year. This level of analysis has produced highly accurate estimates in the city's budget. Actual total property tax receipts in fiscal year 2017 were about $30,000 less than the amount estimated by staff with the receipt of the assessment data. This translated to an accuracy level of 99.95%. In his economic analysis that begins on page 53 of the forecast document, University of Oregon professor and economist Dr. Tim Dewey noted that the expectations for city revenue growth are consistent with the area's likely path of economic activity this year. Dr. Dewey also comments that while steady property price appreciation has lessened revenue loss and compression, residential construction remains constrained. He further notes the issue is not Salem specific, as residential construction activity also remains subdued in Eugene and Springfield areas. Difficulty in obtaining financing, labor shortages, and lot availability may all be contributing factors. Personnel, the major cost driver associated with delivering services, are examined at the position level to help us be as accurate as possible with these costs. This forecast uses annual market adjustments for salaries and employees' rates contained in labor agreements where applicable. Health benefit rates are established using actuarial advice and are informed by forecasting the self-insurance fund. Materials and services have been inflated by a general rate of 2% or the specific rate developed through modeling such as those for fleet services, liability insurance, and radio communications. This graph demonstrates the cost within the forecast for PERS-related expenses in the general fund. Again, with our objective modeling approach, the 5-year forecast employs rates for fiscal years 2020 and the 2022 biennia that are lower than those recently received by the PERS Advisory Board. The board's advisory rates are based upon less current earnings data, and we have assumed that these lower rates do not account for the impact of more recent improved investment earnings. The projected cost difference through the application of our estimates is $1.36 million less expense to the general fund and $2.29 million citywide in fiscal year 2020. Nonetheless, as you can see in this slide, the increases are significant. Eight city funds have a one-page summary of the forecast document beginning on page 43. Using the status of working capital as a measure of fiscal health, most of the funds in this subset appear to be in quite good shape throughout the forecast period. Tonight we will discuss the last 4 funds listed on the slide, starting with the WVCC Fund. The Willamette Valley Communications Center Fund supports the provision of emergency dispatch services to 29 police, fire, and emergency medical services agencies in Marion, Polk, and Lincoln counties. As noted earlier, WVCC and its member agencies have used 2 types of financial models to help inform recommendations to the City Council for the past several years.
Casey, it starts on page 35, if you want to follow along in your handout.
Thank you. And I should note that for each of these 4 that we'll discuss, you will see there in the green box the page on which these forecasts begin. The forecast for fiscal year 2019 through fiscal year 2023 uses the same escalators for member agency rates as employed in the prior year forecast. The results of this current service delivery forecast is revenues and net expenditures that are equivalent with very little use of working capital during the 5-year period. However, replacement of the computer-aided dispatch system is referenced in the risk section of the WVCC forecast. The forecast as currently presented does not provide sufficient excess working capital to pay for a replacement system. A plan to replace the CAD system will need to be formulated during the 5-year period. The division is currently researching multiple options for system replacement, which could have widely varying short-term and long-term costs. Paying for a replacement system will likely require increased rates to member agencies or the realization of additional savings. While we attempt to be as objective and accurate as possible with our forecasting, the forecasts are subject to variability with actual results that differ from dozens of assumptions within the models. With this in mind, we've created the representation you see on this slide to demonstrate through the forecast period our best estimate of the result of working capital and what happens with just a 1% variation in revenues and expenditures. Where available on these slides, the adopted policy level for working capital fund balance is overlaid. The gold line across the 5-year groupings represents the policy adopted by the WVCC board to help guide its budget recommendations. The blue bar at the center of each grouping represents the result to WVCC's working capital based on our forecast. The green bar represents the forecast result augmented by a 1% revenue growth and an additional 1% of expenditure savings. The compounded outcomes of these variables is 2.6 million working capital in excess of policy by fiscal year 2020. The red bar displays the opposite trajectory for revenues, 1% lower and 1% less savings for each of the 5 years. Under this scenario, working capital falls below the WVCC board policy by fiscal year 2020. Starting on page 19, the Public Works Department's Transportation Services Fund supports the operation and maintenance of the city's streets, traffic signals, and sidewalks. The Transportation Services Fund provides the financial structure for departments to respond to City Council's goals addressing long-term support of our community needs for public safety, livability, environmental health, and economic development. 2 factors have contributed substantially to the stabilization of the Transportation Services Fund as displayed in the forecast result. The first contributing factor is the implementation of the streetlight fee previously mentioned to relieve the fund of the operating costs of maintaining the streetlight system. The savings for this fund for electricity costs is in excess of $1 million each year. The second factor is the anticipated result of House Bill 2017 on the state highway funds distributed to Salem. Based upon the state's projections for this increased revenue, the Transportation Services Fund will have the capacity to sustain operations, funding ongoing pavement maintenance activities at nearly $3 million each year, and continue the $1 million annual program for sidewalk repair. Also included is continued and increased funding for pedestrian and bikeway improvements and pavement rehabilitation, and opportunities to pursue transportation grants. As this graph illustrates, the increased funding from the state and anticipated savings of about 8% each year provide for working capital that declines by less than $500,000 by the end of the forecast period. This display of potential variability within the Transportation Services Fund forecast takes what we believe to be an attainable result, represented by the blue bar, and augmenting it by 1% of additional revenue and savings. The outcome is represented in the green bar and is the best case scenario. On the other end of the scenario is a red bar depiction of 1% less revenue and 1% greater expense or lowered savings. The compounded result of this scenario is a 68% decline in working capital in fiscal year 2023 as compared to fiscal year 2018 year end. Now the utility fund, beginning on page 27. The utility fund supports the ongoing operation and maintenance of the utility, including treatment, storage, and delivery of the highest quality drinking water to homes and businesses, collection, conveyance, and treatment of wastewater before it's returned to the Willamette River, and collection and conveyance of stormwater runoff from streets, buildings, and other hard surfaces throughout the system to prevent flooding and to protect the environment. In addition, the fund supports the payment of utility revenue bonds for system infrastructure improvements, as well as annual transfers to the capital improvement plan for pay-as-you-go capital projects. This graph illustrates the utility fund is in very good shape with a 3% revenue slope for the forecast years, escalating costs to operate the utility, and anticipated savings of 8%. Over the 5-year period, working capital is expected to grow slightly, while the amount transferred for system capital projects increases from $16 million to $20 million annually.
Casey, I have a question on that one.
Yes.
Thank you. So I'm confused by this one. It looks like the revenues. Okay, maybe I read it wrong the first time. It looked like I was reading it the other way, where the expenditures were outpacing the revenues, but now that I'm looking at it again, it's the other way. So never disregard.
That would be correct for the final year of the forecast.
Right. Thank you. I looked at it wrong the first time.
In the forecast variable display, the 1% of additional revenue and additional savings makes an already positive result remarkably better. Both the blue and green bars provide sufficient working capital or reserves to cover 120 days of operating costs and an additional amount equivalent to the annual debt service for the fund. The negative variables, 1% less revenue and 1% more expense or less savings, create a result that approximates the equivalent of 120 days of operating costs. Now beginning on page 8, the general fund. The city's general fund supports operations in the areas of public safety, planning, code enforcement, public library, municipal court, parks and recreation, urban development, and support services that provide citywide benefits. The fund accounts for 706 full-time equivalent positions, 58% of the city's total of 1,210 authorized positions. And this chart displays the general fund supported departments and corresponding expenditure budget for year 1 of the 5-year forecast period. So this graph illustrates recent revenue and expenditure history in the general fund and the result of the 5-year forecast. It notes the impact of several significant actions over the past 6 years, including the closure of fire stations, elimination of approximately 40 positions in the fund, and 4 years of legislated PERS relief. During the period of PERS relief, the city also gained revenue from a real market valuation reset and significantly less property tax losses from compression. I'd like to pause for a moment by emphasizing that the forecast can and has been a tool to fulfill the city's mission of providing fiscally sustainable and quality services to our residents. In recent years, we've had some lighthearted discussions about a cliff, its inevitable or improbable arrival, and our position in relation to the cliff. Perhaps it's more appropriate to avoid this analogy, as the truth is that by law we cannot adopt a budget that expends more than our available resources. The goal of the strategic plan related to sustainable services speaks to an appropriate alignment of the 2 lines depicted on this graph. Fiscal challenges occur when the expenditure line climbs above that representing revenues. The strategic plan lays out a number of actions that can be employed to address the situation. These include identifying the desired level of services that can be sustained, revenues to support those services, and alternative ways to deliver services and generate cost savings. As demonstrated in the period prior to the forecast, somewhat similar and very difficult actions were taken to align the services provided with available resources. As a step forward on these actions, we are seriously investigating performance-based budgeting, a tool used by hundreds of communities throughout the nation as a framework for prioritizing services and making data-driven resource allocation decisions. A proposal to enlist the services of outside experts in moving to performance-based budgeting will be presented at the January 16 council work session. So thanks to the city's strong financial management practices, as recognized in a recent bond rating review, and the factors previously noted, the city has established a balance in working capital that exceeds the council policy of 15% of budgeted revenues. Sufficient working capital is not only necessary to maintain a favorable credit rating and reduce borrowing costs, but also to provide the cash on hand to deal with the cyclical nature of revenue receipts. A recent analysis determined that the city needs approximately $22 million in available cash to pay its bills and avoid borrowing and interest costs. As an additional benefit, our present level of fund balance has also afforded us some stability to be thoughtful and deliberate in achieving the goal of sustainable services. With the factors noted earlier, temporary lowered PERS rates, recovery in the housing market with improved property tax receipts, and opportunities to constrain spending, the city has maintained service delivery within a strong fiscal condition for the general fund as measured by working capital. However, expected results in fiscal year 2018 and future projections demonstrate a shift in these metrics. The general fund 5-year forecast is built with a baseline of set assumptions that align with recent results of the current fiscal year projections. The forecast continues the trends experienced with the most recently completed fiscal year, where revenues exceeded expenditures. The gap widens with costs escalating more precipitously than revenues and the addition of ongoing programs and services in the current fiscal year. The general fund is predicted to realize increases in almost every revenue type, with an aggregate increase of 2.4 to 3.9% throughout the forecast period. Individual revenue types are escalated in accordance with recent trends, consistent with a continued level of growth over the past 5 years, and factoring all available data and analysis to support projections. Consistent with last year, we've continued property valuation increases at approximately 4% for all years of the forecast period. The estimated increases are above the statutory limit of 3% due to new growth and are higher than Salem's experience in this current year. Current year collections are expected to increase by a combined rate of 3.4%, which is 0.6% or approximately $300,000 less than anticipated in the budget. We are anticipating growth to continue. The forecasted rate of revenue growth, however, is not sufficient to meet the increasing costs for providing services, which are anticipated to grow by a range of 3 to 6% year over year. The primary drivers of expense increases for the fund remain those associated with the cost of employees. Fiscal year 2018 and 19 is the first of what's anticipated to be multiple biennial PERS rate increases. The employer rate for PERS Tier 1 and 2 increased from 15.8% in fiscal year 2017 to 21% beginning the current fiscal year. With the larger base for salary increases, the year-over-year budget PERS increased by $2.8 million or 36.9% in the general fund. Savings in the forecast, as was discussed earlier, are estimated at 3% of operating budgets and $2.5 million of unspent contingency. Anticipated saving rates are in line with historical trends, but are subject to fluctuation. As was mentioned over the past year, the two largest departments in the general fund, police and fire, have been vigilant in attracting and retaining new officers and firefighting candidates to ensure a high level of employee retention. Within the current fiscal year's increased capacity to deliver services, with lower vacancy rate, it appears at this point there will be much lower expenditure savings than in prior years.
Casey?
Yes, sir.
So, could you go back to the last slide, please? To put this, I guess, I'm on my simple mind here, put it in a little more concise statement. If the council policy is to have 15% in working capital based on, our revenues, that would be 21 million we should have in working capital in 2023, right? 15% of 140 million.
So if I click to this next slide,
Oh,
you'll see the gold bar there.
My question would be, how much revenue in the next 5 years do we have to raise to maintain council policy and a working capital amount that's So we looked at that, and over the 5-year period, the amount was, I believe, $27.5 million, which is roughly the equivalent of about $5 million per year in adjustments, recognizing you have two sides of the ledger to maintain without any service reductions and keep current service delivery. The status quo would be a little over $5 million per year.
So you had said that there was a recent bond rating review. What's the
correct.
rating currently?
We are AA by Moody's. AA2, yes.
Is it just Moody's?
And the most recent one.
Okay. And in the utility fund, you had said that there was a refinance. Is there any other refinances planned for any of the other bonds that are outstanding? And that's the first question. The other being for the police bond, has that bond already been issued?
So the answer, I'll start with the second. That's the easier one. Yes, those bonds have been issued, and work is underway. We have 3 years to expend 85% of the funding. As to the other question with refinancing, this was what we've coined as a summer of debt. We looked at many opportunities. David Lacey and our good finance staff, outstanding finance staff, spent a long period of time looking for those opportunities. However, what you see in those reduced savings increase our capacity to bond items. You can only bond capital projects. They don't necessarily alleviate the situation or provide more or reduce the cost of debt service within the city's general fund that provides the services that we've spoken of.
So with the with the police facility bond, were you able to realize the rate after this, the improved rate, or were you rated after that was already issued?
So we were able to maintain our current bond rating.
Okay.
There was a refunding in the utility fund, as you mentioned,
Yeah.
and that rating was increased and is on par with the city's general fund at this point.
Thanks.
So this graph, which you've seen displayed for the previous 3 funds, reveals possible scenarios in the general fund. The probable is just that, the likely outcome for the next 5 years based on all of our assumptions. While working capital, the gold line on the graph is maintained above City Council policy of 15% of revenues through fiscal year 2019, falls below policy in fiscal year 2020. In the better case scenario, represented by the green bar with 1% greater revenue and 1% more savings, working capital is sustained above City Council policy for an additional year. And the scenario represented by the red bar is overall 1% lower revenues and 1% more expenses or less savings, the result of which would lead to noncompliance with city policy by next fiscal year. We've begun to shift the annual budget process to be more front-loaded with this meeting, providing an opportunity for Budget Committee recommendations to Council. We're undertaking residential surveying at this time, and the City Council policy direction in advance of presenting a budget is anticipated at a work session on January 16th, where the Council will formulate its Council policy agenda for the coming year. That agenda will feed in and be incorporated into department and service area budgets in fiscal year 19. City staff will be developing budgets in the annual capital improvements plan from January through March 2018. As we introduced at the November Budget Committee meeting with a mock publication of public safety services, work is underway to group city functions into a budget document that centers on services. At the same time, we'll begin defining and implementing performance measures, as mentioned at the November meeting, to help determine progress on City Council's strategic goals and actions, as well as service area outcomes. And this will provide a more effective means to better communicate with our residents regarding the services the city provides and better position us for priority-based budgeting. The next set of Budget Committee meetings will occur on April 25th, May 2nd, and May 9th. At these 3 meetings, the Budget Committee will receive the fiscal year 2019 proposed budget, receive public testimony, set the annual property tax levy, and offer a budget recommendation to City Council. The schedule represents 2 fewer meetings than in previous years, where a good portion of each meeting was used by departments to describe programs and services provided to the community. We're exploring different methods to deliver this information to a wider audience. And following Budget Committee meetings, the City Council will convene in June for budget hearings, where the Council
has the ability to modify the Budget Committee recommendation by up to 10% prior to adoption in late June. And this concludes the forecast presentation. I and staff will now be available to address specific questions you may have.
And I'd really like to emphasize that Casey just went through $273 million in about 10 minutes. So please take this opportunity to ask us questions regarding any of the funds that Casey reviewed or funds that weren't part of the presentation.
Questions?
They're just stunned and amazed.
Yeah.
All right, I'll start.
Oh, please, go right ahead.
A couple of things. One, we clearly have an ongoing problem going forward with revenue. What does the staff think are the possibilities for potential revenue increases going forward? I saw somewhere in this a comment that there's a possibility that the city would be looking at gas tax. And my understanding was that we couldn't do that with the new transportation bill that passed in the legislature. But I'm just wondering, are there other potential revenue opportunities that the staff is looking at?
As to the gas tax question, I can't speak specifically. What I can speak to as well is that we've begun some preliminary research to see what alternative resources, I'll call them alternatives, outside of what we're currently doing, may be available or are being employed in other cities. We've also had various revenue committees at the city who have taken a look at some of these issues. So we've gone back and dusted off some of those studies to see what may still be relevant. The strategic plan has a goal of identifying potential revenue sources. I anticipate a committee may be formed at some point to review those and make recommendations. And so we're doing the preliminary research to provide that data to the policymakers to then let us know where further investigation may be required as to items such as the ease of implementation, the timed implementation, and sort of things.
And if you discovered some magic revenue, would you subsequently change your 5-year forecast and resubmit it to us, or?
Well, I will say that we're constantly reforecasting. So the formal document you see may not necessarily change, but what could possibly change, let's say it were something that could be implemented as soon as next fiscal year, you would find that within the budget as additional revenue, and therefore that would change what we had prognosticated moving forward.
In addition to what Deputy City Manager Duncan just shared, we're also, the departments are also looking at the existing fees that council has authorized, the existing fees in comparison to existing county or city policy, excuse me. So we are making sure we're following the direction that's already been given to us by City Council. Also, we're examining the current revenue allocation to funds. I believe in this forecast, for example, there had been in prior years a $400,000 transfer from the general fund to the transportation fund. This forecast assumes that transfer is no longer needed because of the health of that fund, as highlighted by Casey. So those are some other examples of what we're looking at on the revenue side.
Thank you.
Member Bergman?
Yep.
Hey, thank you and good afternoon. I'm sorry, evening, everybody. Let me see if I can figure this out. So thank you, Casey, for your presentation. I had a quick question about council policy regarding the 15% of revenues for working capital.
Mm-hmm.
How conservative and or risky is that? If it was lowered to, say, 10%, could that affect the policy decision-making to maybe a less sharp direction, for example, or is 10% too risky?
So what I can state is that in going through these bond reviews with the review agencies, one of the comments that they've made is that we have a healthy balance at this time, but our policy is actually less than what they typically see by comparable jurisdictions. And so I believe it was a review that we went through a few years back that indicated if levels dropped, the bond rating is important, but I think the other emphasis is on, as I've talked about, that cyclical nature of our expenditures and revenues. So we have to meet payroll obligations, which occur every 2 weeks. But we see a big influx of revenue in November and December for property taxes. So come October, without sufficient capital on hand or cash on hand, we have to borrow from other sources in order to meet those obligations, which then requires an additional borrowing expense to the general fund. So I see that as being an additional advantage, regardless of the impact on our credit rating. So I would say, again, from what GFOA and others have indicated, 15% seems to be kind of at the lower level for these types of policies.
Okay, thank you.
Member Sun?
So where do you see the greatest opportunity for expenditure savings? If revenue were to stay the same, do you play with the model on if we just left revenue the same, but and the 1% expenditure savings was in, or where would you see that opportunity the greatest as far as this particular forecast?
Yeah. We haven't delved into that level of specificity. What I can say is we are constantly looking for cost-saving opportunities. One such example might be our health insurance fund. We've been able to sustain fairly low rates in comparison to what you see nationally, of a 5% or so increase from year to year. And that has to do with some of the programs and things that we're evaluating to contain and reduce those costs. So it's a continuous evaluation of where can we be efficient, what more can we do, and I think that really speaks to the need of a tool such as priority-based budgeting to determine if we're going to look at specific areas to reduce costs, let's hone in on those that through this process may not be seen as quite of high as a priority as others.
So on that, what do you know off the top of your head, what percentage of labor are you spending on benefits in
On
total,
benefits,
not just health
total?
insurance?
Do you have that number?
Yeah. I didn't expect you to have that on the top of your head, but
She would.
Thank you so much.
29.2.
On page 61 of your forecast document, actually, it indicates that for the four funds that we forecast here with the larger forecast, that 10.3% is healthcare costs.
So what about the percentage of actual salaries? So if for every $100 you spend on salaries, how much of that?
And that I don't have off the top of my head, because it varies, of course, because we have employees who make a particular salary, but they have family benefits, and we have employees who make that same salary, but they have single-person benefits. So the cost of the benefit packages vary.
Yeah.
So I don't have an aggregate percentage for you in regard to that, and I'm sorry, I can get it for you.
Yeah, I think he's asking
In total.
in total.
Yeah, I mean, it averages
Cost,
out.
just total of our total cost.
For the general,
Labor cost? I'm sorry, what is labor cost?
Yeah, so if-
In the general fund, it's about 75%, the cost of our personnel, and that would be salary, compensation, retirement benefits. It's in that 75% range in the general fund.
for the
Right.
general fund, it's on page 14.
So I guess what I was asking is the percentage of total labor that's related to benefits overall. So if total labor was, 100 million, what percentage of that is related to benefits? Is it 30%? Is it 25%? Is it 50? Where are you at on kind of that?
And I would, I will tell you, and you're a numbers person too, I don't like to shoot from the hip on those things.
No,
That's what-
yeah, totally.
So
That's-
I will get it for you. I can't tell you right off the top of my head what that percentage is.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I was just asking if that's sort of an opportunity, and being self-insured for health insurance as well, right? If there's opportunity there,
Sure.
as far as looking forward in the 5 years, if there's, where versus cutting services. I mean, if that's a large,
Well, and to an additional comment to what Deputy City Manager Duncan made in regard to health benefits, we're also looking at a wellness clinic. And they have been, there's a lot of indication that a wellness clinic can help us reduce costs, those higher end type costs by, providing that additional opportunity to our employees. So very actively pursuing that right now, as a matter of fact.
have you considered partnering with the hospital on that?
I'll ask our HR director.
Counselor Cook.
Wait a second, Kelly. Thank you for that question. I was really glad to hear about the wellness clinic. Is the 10% pretty typical then for healthcare costs, or
That's as a percentage of total costs.
aligned with other municipality budgets? Is 10% pretty typical, or are we below, or?
I think that we have excellent benefits, and I think that we're probably quite comparable. I would say that we are quite comparable. Our benefits are excellent.
And just to follow up on that, with Public Employee Collective Bargaining Acts, we would be comparable in the overall benefits to other agencies because that's what contracts are based upon.
Excellent. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments?
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, Councilor McCoy.
Comment. I mean, in the strategic planning, we had a work group that Casey was staffing that basically looked at different ways. How are we going to go about trying to find revenues to at least deal with this issue? And I think probably my quote, but you're not going to fee-base our way out of this thing. It's got to be a major funding source that we're going to find if we're going to find $5 million a year. It's going to be some, frankly, a tax of some kind if you're going to get to that point, in my opinion. We can raise every fee and do all the extra cutting we can do, and it's still not going to come anywhere near $5 million a year. We got an issue that's, and that's a lot of money, and it's a challenge for us to do. And it's either that or we're going to cut services. I mean, real blunt.
Councilor Lewis?
Not that this is going to make a huge difference, but the marijuana tax income that the city's going to be getting, what amount would that be per year?
Kelly, do you have that marijuana tax annual receipts? We did build a forecast based upon the most recent receipts that we received with that payment, but I'll let her speak to what the specific numbers are.
No percentage increase, like 4% each year?
Actually, on the marijuana, so let me just get there if you don't mind. So what we are projecting for state shared, now I will tell you that we had a real bump on state shared for marijuana in the current fiscal year because we received payment for the equivalent of 18 months in the current fiscal year. So what we're projecting ongoing is approximately $200,000 per year ongoing with an escalator of approximately 2% each year. And when we know more, when we have a little more data about what to expect there, we'll adjust those escalators as needed.
Okay, and just curiosity, is that, so $200,000, will that reduce that $5 million need, or is that already incorporated?
Oh, it's already incorporated.
Okay.
I'm reading from my revenue forecast right now, and we also have a forecast for our local sales tax as well, and it's
So
incorporated.
we're not going to smoke our way out of this either.
Anyone else? Member Bergman?
I just had a kind of a comment or a reflection. To compare this budget process to the state's process, there are some policies that have been implemented at the statewide level to tighten the fiscal belt, so to speak, and build up that working capital balance. Ideas include, holding vacancy or positions vacant for a mandatory period of, say, 45 days before filling them, or reducing travel and training opportunities, that kind of thing. I think those are policy decisions probably at the council council or the management level, but they're certainly something that I would be in favor of, as opposed to talking at the appropriation level per program or per fund. So I don't know how those two can kind of weave together, but maybe that's kind of downstream, but just a thought.
Councilor Cook? Okay. Councilor Nanki?
And I'll respond to that as well.
Thank you.
We've probably held positions vacant much longer than we like at times, and it's just a matter of what our forecast looks like, and we know how extreme that number looks out at the end, and that's been kind of the way we've been able to manage that 3% savings as well, with, as the city manager indicated, with especially the police department, because they were always late hiring, and then you have such a long training curve, we were minus the public safety resources we need out on the street. And council made a decision to actually, why don't we have those early enough and actually look at the projections on, you know, what kind of turnover we're going to have, people leaving, so that we're always fully manned in those public safety sectors. So as far as training, that we've actually had those issues as well. That's dangerous when you're looking at fire. Legal really needs to keep up on what's happening. There's several of the departments, but you cut back to where you can, but you can't cut too far, or you end up with employees who don't know changes in policies and requirements from mandates on high.
Councilor Hoy?
Thank you. In my experience, hiring freezes, especially as it relates to public safety, are quite dangerous, because if you delay the hiring process, those processes take a long time in law enforcement and in fire, and if you delay them, it takes years to catch up from that delay. And because law enforcement and fire are so competitive these days, we really can't afford that kind of lag. We really have to stay on top of those. I agree that we need to look at options for reducing costs, but I don't think that's where we should be looking.
Councilor Cook?
I guess I will speak to it. I know that that viewpoint, especially, I know we've talked about police and fire, but even I think all of our services are essential, and the city provides a level of service that people expect that live here. Things like the library, things like being able to pay your water bill, or being able to come down and get help from city staff. So when we talk about balancing service needs with revenue, especially coming through what's just been come through, I think we need to be mindful that are we providing that level of service? Are people satisfied with that level of service? And that needs to be discussed in addition to where the finances are, because our obligation as counselors, and in my ward, I know there are people that need more service, that want more service. And those maintenance costs, the day-to-day, it can be easy to overlook, but they add up over time, and you do need to pay for them eventually.
Thank you. Just tag on to some of those comments. So one of them is holding positions open too. Just, I mean, naturally there is an open cycle that happens just by virtue of somebody leaving, but man, is it a blow to morale when those positions are open and you've got people trying to fill all those spots. It's, I have seen people nearly to the breaking point when that happens, and it can be very, very stressful. And we definitely want the city of Salem to be an employer of choice. We don't want to be scraping for people to work here, definitely not. And kind of what Member Cook was saying, you know, we want to provide that quality service. With that said, I think we need to look really seriously at what kind of revenue we can raise. What are the options? And I don't think I fully understand maybe all the options that are available because of Measure 5 and 50, what we can do. I understand it to kind of a layman's level, I guess, of what that really means. But, you know, there's some things that I think Oregon has held dear and in heritage, we just don't do. And I think those things are going to, they will be challenged in the next few years, because holding on to principles are one thing, but just doing it because we've always done it that way isn't going to work anymore. So I think we need to look very seriously about what is possible and really talk about those things that we were unmentionable in the past because we just don't do them.
Thank you. Member Hanslow?
I think also we have to look at, we have a lot of senior citizens in this city, and they have limited incomes. And if we're thinking about raising stuff and everything like that, here again, we go more and more where the people with limited incomes have to make choices, whether it's medication or pay this other tax on something. So I think we have to behoove and look at these things and look at them in a human manner. Thank you.
Member Judy?
Yes. In the strategic plan, the public seemed to indicate a willingness to pay more money in taxes. And, you know, I think that that's a really serious thing that needs to be looked at. As Councilor McCoy said, I think we need to consider whether or not we can push through some sort of a bond measure or increase taxes in some way, because otherwise we have a problem. And the other thing also is that nobody's talking about is the other big elephant in the room, and that's the tax plan that's currently in process in Washington and the budget in Washington, and how that may be affecting us in the next couple of weeks once we see, you know, how Oregon would be impacted by these two options.
Anyone else? Member Nordyke.
Sure, thank you. I would just echo your comments. I'd like to have a very clear, straightforward explanation of what our options are in layman's terms for a non-budget person like myself. I understand what the options are, preferably in bullet points with lots of jazzy little slides. I love those. I told Kelly I'm dazzled by all of the multicolored pie charts and such. Those are very helpful for me. I'm a visual learner for sure. So yeah, let's talk about the options, including the unpopular ones, in the years and the weeks, months to come.
I have a question. At the January 16th council meeting, that's where some of these things are going to be discussed. Is that correct? On your policy agenda?
Yes, the January 16th work session will be a discussion by council of the strategic issues that were identified through the community survey, through the community open houses, through the various other means of public input, the discussion of those issues by council work groups, which those work groups develop specific actions to move those issues, to make progress on those issues. Those actions have been reviewed by staff for feasibility, including economic budget feasibility, as well as some sequencing and some logical what should follow what, and that information will be provided to council for their review and discussion.
Okay, which I would think that the members of the Budget Committee, we can certainly attend and listen, but I do think that that will be an important meeting for us to heed. Because when you come back in April, they'll have a budget for us to be considering.
And if I may, Chairperson, as was discussed earlier, certainly one of those strategic issues is the sustainability of services, the fiscal right. issue, financial issue for the city.
Okay, thank you. Anything else? Okay.
What time is that meeting?
I presume 6, but
6 o'clock. Yes.
Here in the chambers. Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Okay, I didn't. I'm sorry. Yes.
I guess, yeah. My one question is, I don't know how firm this policy is when we say policy. I mean, when do we actually run out of time in terms of coming up with a budget where the expenditures and the revenues align? And we don't have, do we have until 2023? Do we have until the end of this year if it doesn't go well? I mean, what's the deadline?
Starting today, we're about halfway through a fiscal year, so really it gets real challenging 3.5 years out. We're below council policy in 2.5 years.
Okay. Great. Okay, I did not.
If I may, it
Please,
depends on if there's,
absolutely.
you could also call a big chunk of that contingency, and if there's certain things that happen in the community, that number can be diminished relatively quickly. Or we run into significant issues like 2007, and I was glad we moved up to 15% in a reserve, because otherwise we'd have been cutting double the number of employees we had previously. So we try to keep that even across, so when it comes to the end of the budget and the budget that's presented, it'll say, this is how much we have to actually balance that. Either we have to cut this much in services or raise this much in revenue on an annual basis. As the budget is passed, it has to be balanced by law. And then the ending fund balance is council policy and budget committee on wish list days at the end of the budget. How much can we afford to possibly move that? And that's where some of the tough decisions come in on using essentially one-time money for ongoing labor and projects.
Councilor Lewis.
Yeah, I guess a question, I don't know for Kelly or, but you hear the talk about the 15%, but I'm also hearing the talk about the desire to have $22 million in today's world so we don't have to borrow and pay interest. So, which is more important? And to you.
I think, they're of equal importance. I mean, the 15% of revenues will roughly estimate that 22 million. And we've found that just very recently, and of course that 22 million number goes up every year, the amount that's required for us to meet our obligations before we see that big influx of revenue as a result of property tax. So it would be hard for me to say one's more, they're related. Those two things are very related.
Okay, third time's a charm. Yeah. I did not have anybody sign up from the audience for public testimony. Is there anybody here who has any comments they'd like to make? No? Okay. All right. Okay, well, seeing none, we'll move on to item number 7, and this is an opportunity for the Budget Committee to discuss general policies and any other issues or concerns. I think maybe we've taken care of that, huh? Yes, Councilor Lewis.
Yeah, I want to throw this twist in. This is my third time around, and it's very, very interesting, but what we usually do is we start with a budget, and as we're going through it, we create this thing called the wish list. And then after the budget process, we go over the wish list. Some of those things get adopted, some of them don't. And then we start all over the very next year. I'd like to see us bring back those aspects on the wish list from last year that didn't get funded and have those be part of the discussion initially rather than waiting until the very end. Because some of those, who knows, may be incorporated in this year's budget, I don't know.
If I may, thank you, Member Lewis, for that comment. I think, though, the strategic planning effort was really initiated based upon this body, this committee's direction to staff. direction such as more input before the cake is baked, more strategic direction regarding staff's preparation of recommended budgets for this group to consider. Certainly, part of that will be past needs, past requests, past wishes. However, we will be really hoping in helping you, helping council, and then later the budget committee, but first with council on January 16th, work through those wishes, those needs that have a resource piece to it, as well as those that don't. And that really will be what will guide the staff's work on the budgets that will be shared with you in April. I think it will be up to this body, the budget committee. You can certainly still have a wish list step at the end as you go through the department budgets, and if we've missed the mark, or if for other reasons there are items that aren't identified, aren't included, or aren't included at a level that you would prefer, either more or less, that would be an opportunity for that wish list process to still be used. But we're really working toward the 16th to be that time for council to provide. These are our wishes. These are our desires. These are our priorities. These are our policy agenda items for the coming year.
Thank you.
Can I, I'll ask one more question, maybe. Just about the health of the working capital fund. So if we follow the forecast, the working capital fund will be depleted by 2023. And if we need to bring it in alignment with city policy, we need to bend the cost curve either through increases in revenues or reduction in spending, $5 million a year starting this year, starting next year. And if we don't do it next year, then it becomes $7 million a year. And if we don't do it the year after that, it gets, the hill becomes steeper. But then this is, I guess, my new guy question, is that I don't know at what point the budget committee or the city council is presented with the options. Is it April 25th? Is it January 16th? When are we going to see a slate of options from city staff saying these are the ways to bend the cost curve?
If that's the direction of the budget committee, we can certainly do that. And the level of specificity will generate certainly some interest on how to bend that curve. We can certainly work on having something like that available for April. It's really the pleasure of the budget committee.
And what I might add with, in looking at this, that this shows with some variation what could occur. It's always a delicate balance in acting quickly but not too quickly, and ensuring that your estimates are correct. And again, we've talked about kind of this planned approach, recognizing that we have an issue we need to deal with. And part of that in the strategic plan was we need to set up a framework to identify what are our core priority services that we're going to continue to fund. In addition to that, we're taking a look at what revenue opportunities are there available that we might consider. And then, as the city manager spoke to, it's a policy decision regarding how do we address this. Are we going to look, which side of the ledger, speaking in accounting terms, are we going to come from? Probably, will it be both? Will it be more one direction than the other? And that's kind of the policy direction that would be given to us to provide the data to the decision makers to move forward.
Councilor Nanki.
And just to kind of address that question as well, and you heard Deputy City Manager Duncan at the very beginning talk about a lighthearted cliff.
As depicted in red on the chart.
If you look at the 5-year forecast every year going back, you'll see that it's basically out near that 5-year.
Right.
And we look at what's happening in the present year, to keep it at least that far out. Because to have it come any closer to us, then you're talking about that really steep slope that is hard to overcome. It does another good thing in the respect that it gives us pause to actually try to spend a lot of extra money. But again, it's just looking out with everything equal. This is where it looks 5 years from now, and what do we have to do to at least keep it that far away from us?
Councillor Hoy?
I think this is the appropriate time for me to mention that the mayor asked me to remind the committee that we are driving along the cliff and not off the cliff. Since he's not able to be here, he wanted to be sure that that was mentioned, that we're driving along the cliff.
We are.
Not off the cliff.
And we want to keep
Well,
distance between the car and the cliff.
And I can imagine that it looked similarly bad 4 years ago before the PERS relief was enacted, or there's other costs that, or other things that happen between now and 2023, but that's a downward trend.
Yes, I would say the only difference in that simply now is the cliff starting to erode towards where we're driving.
But, and they mentioned it earlier, we let 40 employees go in this year. We've had 60 go in past years, so it's not like we're just skirting alongside this cliff there. To maintain that distance, we've made serious cuts. We've gotten rid of entire departments. Administratively wise, we've done close to what we can do. So, and I remember in my first years, Bob Wells says, someday you guys are going to have to make the big decision and bring that line up and figure out what it takes to do that, because otherwise we just slowly gnaw into the body.
Okay. Is there any other business before the Budget Committee this evening? No? Seeing none, we're adjourned.